Welcome, everybody, to History Analyzed. I'm your host, Mark Palmer. This is a podcast which examines historical events and issues. The event we're analyzing today is Conquistador Hernan Cortes conquering the Aztec Empire. We all know guys who have way too much self-confidence, but sometimes that self-confidence proves to be justified. Such was the case with Hernan Cortes. In 1519, he decided that he could conquer the Aztec Empire consisting of millions of people, even though he only had between 500 and 600 men under his command. And I'm about to tell you how, in 2 years' time, a combination of guts, ingenuity, political brilliance, technology, and some help from unintentional germ warfare, Cortes pulled off arguably the greatest conquest in history. I'm not saying this was necessarily a good thing. I'm just saying it's remarkable that such a small group could inflict so much damage and death on hundreds of thousands and possibly millions of people. First, let's set the scene. In 1519, the Spanish Empire was still in its infancy. This was only 27 years after Columbus first came to the Western Hemisphere on behalf of the Spanish crown. At that time, the Spanish had conquered some of the Caribbean islands. Their base of operations was the island of Hispaniola. That's the island that is now divided between the countries of Haiti and the Dominican Republic. They had recently conquered the largest island in the Caribbean, Cuba, but the Spanish had yet to conquer any parts of the mainland of North America. In 1519, the Aztec Empire was at its zenith. Since they did not have written records, our primary sources of information are from the Spanish conquistadors. And in case you're unfamiliar with that term, it simply is Spanish for conquerors. Throughout this episode, most of the numbers are only going to be estimates because, unfortunately, that's all we have. It's estimated that the Aztec Empire had approximately 10 million people in it. Who knows if that estimate's anywhere close to accurate? A lot of those people were not Aztecs, but were subjugated tribes of other Native Americans who had been conquered by the Aztecs. In reality, none of the people were truly Aztecs because they did not call themselves that. The Native Americans that we call Aztecs called themselves Mexica. It's spelled M-E-X-I-C-A but pronounced Mexica. That's where the modern name of Mexico comes from. It seems that the name Aztec came from a history book in 1780 published in New Spain about the history of New Spain. The Spaniards called Mexico New Spain until the country gained its independence in 1821. That historian in the 1700s called them Aztecs because they supposedly came from a place called Aztlan, which is believed to have been located in northern Mexico. After that, the term Aztec caught on with other historians. So I'm just going to use that term Aztec since that is how they are primarily known today, and that's how they're referenced in all the books. Their native language was not called Aztec, but called Nahuatl. The Aztec Empire covered a large portion of what is now the central section of Mexico, all the way from the Pacific Ocean to the Gulf of Mexico. The capital city of the Aztec Empire was a marvel of engineering called Tenochtitlan. When the Spanish arrived on the scene in 1519, Tenochtitlan had over 200,000 inhabitants. This made it one of the largest cities in the world. It's believed that only Paris and Constantinople had larger populations at the time. Constantinople was the prior name for the city now known as Istanbul. To put the size of Tenochtitlan into perspective, at that time, London had only a population of approximately 50,000 people. Fun fact, for the entire 19th century, London was the largest city in the world. From the year 1800 to the year 1900, London had a larger population than any other city. In 1800, London had a population of approximately 1.1 million people. By 1900, the population had skyrocketed to 6.9 million people. Okay, back to Tenochtitlan. The city was located on an island in Lake Texcoco. That lake was located in the Valley of Mexico. This was an enormous lake. The estimates for the size of Lake Texcoco, when the Spanish arrived in 1519, vary wildly. I've seen a lot of different estimates, but the lake may have been as large as 2,000 square miles at the time of the Spanish conquest. To put that into perspective, Lake Ontario is 7,340 square miles. If that estimate about the size of Lake Texcoco is anywhere close to accurate, that means it would be about a quarter of the size of Lake Ontario. And if you've ever been to any of the Great Lakes in North America, you realize that they are essentially small seas and not lakes. They're only called lakes because they have fresh water. Anyway, Lake Texcoco was a large place. So why did the Aztecs build their city on an island in a large lake? Apparently, they were a nomadic tribe. One reason they were not popular with any of their neighbors and had to keep moving was because of their religion being based upon human sacrifice, which I'll describe in great detail later on. According to legend, the Aztecs were destined to roam around what is now the country of Mexico until they saw a particular sign. What was that sign? They would know that they had found their permanent home when they saw an eagle with a snake in its beak perched upon a cactus. The Mexican flag of today looks just like the Italian flag, with green, white, and red vertical bars, except for the emblem in the middle. The logo in the middle of the Mexican flag is the national emblem of the nation of Mexico. That national emblem is an eagle with a snake in its beak perched upon a cactus. In around the year 1325, the Aztecs entered the Valley of Mexico and supposedly saw an eagle perched on a cactus with a snake in its beak on a marshy island in Lake Texcoco. The reason why the marshy island was uninhabited and available to the Aztecs was because it was difficult to build there. The Aztecs used a lot of ingenious techniques in their construction. Primarily, they drove large pilings into the bottom of the lake and then built stable surfaces on top of the pilings. With stone and dirt from the surrounding areas, the Aztecs expanded their island. It's believed that at its zenith, Tenochtitlan was approximately 5 square miles. To put that into perspective, Manhattan is just under 23 square miles. So, Tenochtitlan was approximately 1/5 the size of Manhattan. That's pretty big for a city in the 1500s. The main temple in Tenochtitlan was supposedly as high as a modern 15-story building. That's very impressive. The Aztecs built an aqueduct to bring fresh water into the city, and they built 3 causeways which connected Tenochtitlan to the mainland of the Valley of Mexico. These were essentially stone roads connecting the city to the mainland. The causeways were located in the north, south, and west parts of the city. To the east of Tenochtitlan, the lake was far too large to build a causeway. The construction of these causeways, as well as the entire city of Tenochtitlan, was even more impressive when you consider that they did not have any beasts of burden, no horses, mules, or donkeys. All of the stone and rocks were moved by people, and they carried this all by hand or in some type of baskets because they did not have any wheeled carts. Sorry, but I'm about to go off on a tangent. There's a question about whether or not the Aztecs or the Maya or any of the Native Americans had the wheel. Some historians claim that ancient toys from the Native Americans had wheels on them before the Europeans arrived. Supposedly, they were the kind of pull toys that you see today with a toy animal with wheels on it that a child could pull along. I find it extremely hard to believe that the Aztecs or any other of the Native Americans would be aware of the wheel and put them on toys for their kids, but not use the wheel for carts, wagons, or wheelbarrows. They did not even have any potter's wheels. A potter's wheel is a horizontal revolving disc on which wet clay is shaped into pots or other ceramic objects. I simply cannot believe that these people were aware of the wheel and chose not to use the wheel for any construction or industrial purpose even when they had roads and causeways on which they could use wheeled vehicles. Some historians argue that the natives of Mesoamerica were aware of the wheel, but did not use it for any commercial purposes because they did not have any beasts of burden to pull a wheeled vehicle. I don't find that argument convincing. Anybody who has used a wheelbarrow knows that you can transport much heavier objects using your own strength with a wheelbarrow than you can by carrying the object on your back. The same applies for a cart or wagon. One or two people could pull a lot more weight in a cart or wagon than they could on their backs. All right, those are my doubts about whether or not the Native Americans had wheels on toys. But assuming that they did have wheeled toys predating the arrival of Europeans, that's still not a functioning wheel. You have to scale things up to the size where they would be practical on carts, wagons, or wheelbarrows. Even if they had some disc-shaped objects and used them to roll a toy around, they still did not have a practical wheel. To have a wheel which would be useful for transportation for a cart, wagon, or a wheelbarrow, they would need more than just a round disc. I have no engineering background, but from my understanding, the necessary components for a practical wheel includes a proper axle. Carts, wagons, and wheelbarrows use a dead axle or lazy axle. That means an axle which supports the wheels but does not propel them. The wheel has to be fitted properly to the axle and be tight enough that the wheel would not wobble off the axle, but loose enough to allow for lubrication. Without the lubrication or greasing, there would be too much friction, which would prevent the vehicle from moving. Metal tools were necessary to do the fine fitting of the axle and the wheel. Since the Native Americans did not have metal tools, they could not make functional wheels. Cortes built carts, which were the first wheeled vehicles used in North America. Just because they didn't have the wheel is not an indictment of the Native Americans. They did a lot of other impressive things that the Europeans did not think of. But regarding the wheel, it seems that they did not have a practical wheel. Okay, back to today's topic. The Aztec Empire was not the same as European empires. The Aztecs allowed the heads of different tribes to remain in charge. The subjugated tribes or city-states simply had to pay the required tribute to the Aztecs. The tribute could be commodities and often consisted of human beings to be sacrificed in the Aztec religion. You could see why the conquered tribes within the Aztec Empire were not too crazy about the Aztecs. Okay, I've made several references to their practice of human sacrifice. It was not done out of malice. It was a central part of their religion. The Aztec religion, which was based upon existing Mesoamerican religions, was based on many gods. The Aztecs believed in approximately 200 gods. And they thought that the gods needed to be appeased to make the sun rise every morning and the rains come and the food to grow. And the way to placate these gods was with human blood. In their sacrifices, 4 priests would hold down the victim, one holding each arm or leg. A 5th priest would cut open the victim's chest and carve out their heart. The priest would then hold the still beating heart high up as an offering to the gods. They would then smear the victim's blood all over the temple. As a side note, contrary to popular myth, the victims for human sacrifice did not need to be a virgin. If that was the case, it would be pretty easy to avoid becoming a human sacrifice. Think about it. All right, so the Aztecs sacrificed people captured in warfare or given to them as tribute by their client tribes and city-states. And for some rituals, they felt that children and babies made the best sacrifices. Yeah, think about that one. We don't know how many human sacrifices occurred each year at the hands of the Aztecs. It was certainly in the thousands. Back in the 1970s, a professor at UC Berkeley estimated that the Aztecs sacrificed as many as 250,000 people per year. That assessment seems ludicrously high. I find that number very difficult to believe because it wouldn't be sustainable year in and year out, even if there were 10 million people in the empire. That would average out to 685 people sacrificed per day. I don't think any historians take that estimate seriously anymore. Most historians now think that it was probably somewhere between 1,000 to 20,000 people per year. I know that is a very wide range, but it's simply historians trying to make estimates on very limited evidence. Even if it was 1,000, that is an incredible number of people to intentionally kill and rip out their beating hearts every year just to appease the gods. So how was Cortes able to conquer this enormous empire? Even if we just limit the forces opposing the Spaniards to the Aztecs themselves and exclude the millions of people in the empire who were part of the subjugated peoples, Cortes still had to conquer hundreds of thousands of Aztecs. The number one reason Cortes was successful was technology. This breaks down into several categories. Category A is steel. The Spaniards had steel swords along with steel armor. The breastplates and helmets made out of steel granted a lot of protection to the conquistadors. The Aztec weapons were made out of obsidian. That's an igneous rock which is formed by the rapid cooling of lava from volcanoes. Obsidian made very good arrowheads and hatchets, but it was no match for steel. And the armor worn by the Aztecs was made out of unspun cotton stitched between two layers of cloth. Such armor did not provide nearly the level of protection of steel breastplates and steel helmets. Category B for the advanced technology of the Spaniards was gunpowder. The only projectiles that the Aztecs had were arrows and spears. The Spaniards had crossbows, which were much more accurate and deadly because of the speed of those projectiles. But the big thing that the Spaniards had were guns and cannons. Besides the devastating physical effect of a cannonball sent through a mass of Aztec warriors, the noise itself was incredibly frightening. Category C for the advanced technology of the Spaniards was advanced naval knowledge. The Aztecs used canoes effectively in warfare, but the conquistadors knew how to build large ships that could be powered both by rowing as well as wind through the use of sails. As I'll explain later, one of the most brilliant ideas by Cortes was to build a small fleet of ships on Lake Texcoco. As I just outlined, the number one reason Cortes was successful was technology. But the second reason Cortes was able to conquer the Aztecs was his brilliant use of diplomacy. As I explained earlier, the Aztecs were not very popular with most of the people in their empire. Millions of people lived in the empire because they had been conquered by the Aztecs. They were not there by choice. Having to pay tribute in both goods as well as people for human sacrifice did not endear the Aztecs to most of their subjects. Cortes eventually convinced thousands of Native Americans who were not Aztecs but were living under the thumb of the Aztecs to join him. This wasn't an easy task. These people were very afraid of their Aztec rulers. They would only join up with the Spaniards because they were convinced that Cortes could win. This brings up a side subject. How was Cortes able to communicate with the Native Americans? It was mostly because of two people. Before he landed on the mainland of what is now Mexico, Cortes first went to the island of Cozumel. Living among the natives, Cortes found two Spaniards who had been shipwrecked there and had been living for years among the indigenous people. One of those men did not want to leave, but the other did. He was a priest named Father Geronimo de Aguilar. He could speak the local languages as well as his native tongue of Spanish. A more important interpreter was a woman who was listed by many names: Malinel, Malintzin, and Doña Marina. She is most commonly referred to as La Malinche. So who was La Malinche? She was an enslaved Aztec girl who had been sold across the Yucatan Peninsula. As a result, she could speak the language of the Aztecs as well as the languages of the indigenous tribes of the Yucatan Peninsula. When Cortes conquered the Maya city of Pontonchan in 1519, local rulers gave him gifts of gold and enslaved women and girls. Yes, women and girls were treated as commodities. One of the young women was La Malinche. As the women and girls were distributed among Cortez's men, he kept La Malinche for himself. We really don't know how old she was at this point, but historians think she was in her late teens. For a while, the only way for Cortez to communicate with the Aztecs was to speak to Father de Aguilar in Spanish, who would translate into one of the Yucatan languages to La Malinche, and she would translate those words into the language of the Aztecs. This was very cumbersome. However, La Malinche was apparently really smart and very good with languages. During the course of Cortez's conquest of the Aztecs, she learned to speak Spanish, so Cortez could simply use La Malinche as his one translator when speaking with the Aztecs or some of the other tribes who he convinced to become his allies. Eventually, Cortez and La Malinche developed a close relationship, and she even bore him a son. That son was one of the first mixed-blood people born in the Americas who had both indigenous and Spanish heritage. And it wasn't just a sexual relationship. Apparently, Cortez grew to value her opinions and advice. That's pretty remarkable when you consider the horrendous status of women in those days. As I just outlined, the number one reason Cortez was successful was technology, and the second reason Cortez was able to conquer the Aztecs was his brilliant use of diplomacy. The third reason Hernan Cortes was able to vanquish the Aztec Empire was the domesticated animals the Spaniards brought with them. This came down to two types of animals: dogs and horses. The Native Americans had dogs when the Europeans arrived, but they did not have war dogs. The Spaniards brought with them large dogs bred to attack and kill people. These were mostly mastiffs and wolfhounds. The natives really did not have a defense for such dogs. We have no estimates as to how many Native Americans were killed by such war dogs. Even more important than the dogs were the horses. There had been wild horses in North America thousands of years ago. However, somewhere between 8,000 to 12,000 years ago, the wild horses became extinct in North America. Scientists are not exactly sure why that occurred. So when the Spaniards arrived, the Native Americans had never seen a horse. An armed conquistador sitting atop of a horse was a very terrifying sight for a Native American warrior standing on the ground. And this was especially true for people who were fleeing the conquistadors, who were easily run down by the Spaniards on horseback. In 1519, Cortez introduced the horse to North America. Originally, he only had 16 horses. A later ship brought him 12 more. Those 28 horses were an enormous advantage against Native American foot soldiers. Decades later, some of the horses escaped from the Spanish forts and towns and became feral. The wild horses spread throughout North America. Eventually, the Native Americans, particularly the natives of the Plains area of the United States, captured and used some of the wild horses. Those tribes of the Plains in the central U.S. developed a culture of life based around the horse. I've given you the first three reasons why Hernan Cortes was successful against the Aztecs. Number one was the successful use of technology. Number two was Cortez's brilliant use of diplomacy to acquire Native American allies. Number three was the use of war dogs and horses. And the fourth reason why Cortez conquered the Aztec Empire was completely unintentional: germ warfare. There were many European diseases which killed the Native Americans, including measles and influenza. But by far the biggest killer was smallpox. The natives in the Americas had no immunity to these European diseases. And as these poor people died, they could not understand why the Europeans seemed immune to these plagues. There were some in the Aztec Empire who viewed the Spaniards as gods. The fact that a devastating plague like smallpox did not seem to affect the Spaniards added to the belief that they might be gods. The Spaniards had immunity to these European diseases because they had been exposed to diseases such as smallpox growing up in Spain. It is estimated that in the year 1520, approximately 40% of the Aztec population died of smallpox. In addition, there were countless others who were seriously ill and weakened and unable to fight the conquistadors, but did not die. As horrendous as that 40% figure is, consider this. European diseases eventually wiped out approximately 90% of the Native Americans throughout the Western Hemisphere. We only have estimates because we do not know how many people were living in the Americas before 1492, but the percentage of dead is somewhere close to 90%. Think about what an insane figure that is. The Black Death swept through Europe between 1347 and 1351. We only have estimates, but it is believed that somewhere between 30% to 60% of all of the Europeans were killed by that plague. It was horrendous and had an enormous effect on human history. But the Black Death wasn't anywhere close to the ravages of European diseases on the Native Americans. Okay, so I've outlined the reasons why Cortes was successful. Now for a brief history of how the conquest actually occurred. Hernan Cortes was born in Spain in 1485. And, in an amazing coincidence, he was a second cousin once removed of Francisco Pizarro. In case you're not familiar with that name, he's the conquistador who led the Spanish forces which conquered the Inca Empire, which is located in what is now Peru. When Cortes was born, the Spaniards were still fighting the Muslims from North Africa, known as the Moors, who had been occupying Spain since the year 711 CE. Finally, in 1492, the Spaniards conquered Granada, the last stronghold of the Moors in Spain. Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand now had control of all of Spain, so they finally agreed to finance Christopher Columbus and his plan to reach Asia by sailing west across the Atlantic Ocean. If you haven't listened to my episode regarding Columbus, I would certainly recommend that you do so. But for today's purposes, all you need to know is that after 1492, the Spaniards started colonizing the islands of the Caribbean. The home base for Spanish rule in the Americas was the island of Hispaniola. That is the island that is now divided between Haiti and the Dominican Republic. When he was only 18 or 19 years old, Hernan Cortes arrived in Hispaniola in 1504, seeking adventure and riches. In 1511, Cortes moved on to the largest island in the Caribbean, Cuba. Cortes did well in the Spanish conquest of the natives of Cuba, and so was rewarded with the position of secretary to the governor of Cuba, a man named Diego Velázquez de Cuellar. He is usually simply referred to as Velázquez. Even though he was a young man, Cortes moved up in the Spanish society of Cuba. He acquired land, cattle, and Native American slaves. But Cortes wanted more. He was given his opportunity in late 1518. The Spaniards had explored the coast of mainland North America, but had not established any permanent colonies. Cortes was appointed by Velázquez, the governor of Cuba, to lead an expedition to explore the North American continent in what is now the country of Mexico. Cortes was given the title of Captain General. Just before Cortes was to sail from Cuba, he had a major falling out with Velázquez. The governor revoked Cortes's charter, but Cortes sailed anyway. This essentially meant that he was acting illegally, but he didn't care. Cortes first stopped at the island of Cozumel, which is off the Yucatan Peninsula. That is where he discovered the Spanish priest, Father Geronimo de Aguilar. As I explained earlier, de Aguilar had been living among the Maya and had learned their language as well as some of the other local languages. He became an interpreter for Cortes. After leaving Cozumel, Cortes took his 11 ships to a native city called Potochan. After defeating the natives, Cortes was given approximately 20 women and young girls. As I described earlier, one became his translator and confidant, as well as love interest, La Malinche. Cortes then led his fleet to find a location to found a permanent city. He picked the area which is now the Mexican city of Veracruz. That city was founded by Cortes in 1519. When Cortes landed on the Mexican coast and founded Veracruz, he had 11 ships with somewhere between 500 and 600 men. There are disputes about the number of soldiers and sailors he had. Most importantly, he had 16 horses. As I explained earlier, another ship arrived later, which provided him an additional 12 horses. After setting up the town of Veracruz, Cortes had the town government declare that Cortes was now the Chief Justice and the Captain General of Veracruz. Cortes had a legalistic mind and used this pretext as a legal basis for his further explorations and conquest in Mexico. He was still feuding with the governor of Cuba, but wanted to present a legal rationale to the Spanish crown. While he was establishing Veracruz, Cortes received representatives from the Aztec Emperor Montezuma. He was actually Montezuma II, but I'll simply refer to him as Montezuma. In his capital city of Tenochtitlan, Montezuma had received word of the strange visitors. He sent ambassadors with gifts including gold and jewels. Montezuma's representatives offered the gifts to Cortes if he and his men would leave and go back to where they came from. Cortes was happy to take the gold and other valuables, but he had no intentions of leaving. Now that Cortes had set up the first permanent Spanish town in what would become Mexico, what should he do next? A lot of his men wanted to go home to Spain, or at least to Cuba or Hispaniola. They had plenty of gold and other riches, and they thought they should quit while they were ahead. But Cortes wanted to go to Tenochtitlan. He sent one ship back to Spain with all of the gold and treasure that he had accumulated. Most of his men were very upset by this. The crown was only entitled to 1/5 of everything recovered, but Cortes had bigger plans, and he wanted the king to be on his side, so he sent all of the gold and jewels that he had. Some of the conquistadors were more than just disgruntled. Some were actually considering mutiny. Cortes discovered that some of his men were planning on seizing a ship and escaping to Cuba. He put down the rebellion and hanged the leaders. Now comes the most famous thing you've probably heard about Hernan Cortes, that he burned his own ships. Unfortunately, that's not true. He did destroy his own ships, he just did not burn them. He had all of the equipment and anything of any value taken off of the 10 remaining ships, and then had holes drilled into the bottoms so they would sink. The 500 to 600 Spaniards with Cortes and Veracruz now understood that there was no going back. They were stranded in a hostile land, and they would either conquer or die. Although he had steel, horses, and gunpowder to give him an advantage, Cortes understood that he needed more soldiers. Through his interpreters, he learned that many of the people in the Aztec Empire hated their Aztec overlords. By using both the carrot and the stick, Cortes convinced thousands of the natives to fight along with the Spaniards. This was not an easy thing to do. Most of the subjugated peoples in the Aztec Empire were very afraid of the Aztec retribution that would come. But after crushing various tribes in battle, Cortes then offered the defeated natives to join him. He was able to convince some of the tribes that he could win and that this was their one chance to get rid of the hated Aztecs. The Tenochtitlan tribe became his primary ally and supplied most of the soldiers he took on his way to Tenochtitlan. On his way to Tenochtitlan, the Spaniards were going to pass through the second largest city in the Aztec Empire, Cholula. Most Americans today only recognize that name because it's a brand of hot sauce, which is actually my favorite. But Cholula was considered the most sacred city in the Aztec Empire and had an enormous pyramid that was supposedly comparable to the Great Pyramids of Egypt. Montezuma realized that bribery had not worked. Giving gold and jewels to Cortes did not make him go away. So Montezuma ordered the people of Cholula to kill the conquistadors. Cortes learned of this trap from his female guide and translator, La Malinche. So Cortes ordered a preemptive strike and killed thousands of the Cholulans and burned their city. Cortes was sending a message to all of the other cities and tribes of the empire that they better not resist the Spaniards or they would suffer the same fate. After the massacre at Cholula, none of the other native tribes attempted to halt the Spaniards and their native allies as they marched toward Tenochtitlan. In November 1519, Cortes reached the Aztec capital. Montezuma welcomed Cortes and his men into the city. Historians have debated for centuries why Montezuma welcomed the conquistadors into Tenochtitlan. Some believe that he thought that the Spanish were gods. There had been a legend in the Aztec religion that someday men with beards would arrive from the direction of the rising sun and conquer the empire. Well, the Spaniards did arrive from the east and did have beards, and their technology and their horses made them seem to be more than mortal men. Other historians believe that Montezuma welcomed the conquistadors into his capital city because he thought there was no stopping them. Montezuma had received reports of the small number of strange men conquering all of the native tribes that tried to oppose them. Still, other historians think that Montezuma thought that he could possibly coexist with Cortes and the conquistadors. Obviously, he was wrong. Montezuma allowed Cortes and his men to stay in one of the palaces. It's unclear where the allies like the Tenochtitlan and other native allied soldiers stayed, but they were in the city with Cortes. Shortly after their arrival, there was an incident where some of the Spaniards were killed. Cortes decided that the way to prevent any further insurrections by the Aztecs was to capture Montezuma and hold him captive. Within a week or so of the Spaniards' arrival in Tenochtitlan, Montezuma was a prisoner in his own city. Cortes used Montezuma as a puppet ruler. Theoretically, Montezuma was still the emperor of the Aztecs, but he was taking his orders from Hernan Cortes. This situation dragged on from November 1519 until June of 1520. In April 1520, a new Spanish fleet arrived in Veracruz. There were 19 ships and approximately 1,400 soldiers under the command of Panfilo de Narvaez. These ships and soldiers were sent by the governor of Cuba, Velazquez. As I explained earlier, Cortes had a major falling out with Velazquez, and Cortes's commission had been rescinded, but Cortes had sailed anyway. Now the Cuban governor sent a large force to capture Cortes or to simply kill him. Cortes learned of this new Spanish fleet from Montezuma. Even though he had been a prisoner of the Spaniards in his own capital city since the prior November, the Aztec emperor was still receiving reports from his subjects as to what was occurring throughout his empire. So how did Cortes handle this new threat? He left some of his soldiers in Tenochtitlan to guard Montezuma and keep him prisoner. Cortes took the rest of his soldiers to deal with the new Spanish force under the command of Narvaez. Cortes and his men caught Narvaez and his superior numbers by surprise somewhere inland of Veracruz. After a small battle, Cortes captured Narvaez, and then the charismatic Cortes convinced the opposing soldiers to join him. This added approximately another 1,000 Spanish soldiers to Cortes's command. Some of the men under Narvaez had remained in Veracruz. Probably of equal importance to the additional soldiers, Cortes gained approximately 70 more horses. Cortes then took his combined force of his original soldiers, the new Spanish soldiers, and approximately 2,000 Native American allies back over the mountains to Tenochtitlan. When he got back to the capital city of the Aztecs in June 1520, he discovered that the situation had greatly deteriorated during his absence. The man that Cortes had left in charge of Tenochtitlan was one of his most trusted lieutenants, Pedro de Alvarado. He may have been loyal to Cortes, but he did not display good judgment. When Cortes was away from Tenochtitlan, a dispute arose between the Aztecs and the Spaniards. Whatever was the cause of the dispute, it resulted in Alvarado ordering an attack which resulted in many deaths of the Aztec nobility. This caused a mass uprising by the Aztec people. Cortes and his men were able to get back into the city over one of the three causeways. Cortes then ordered Montezuma to speak to his subjects to try to calm them down and allowed the Spaniards to completely leave the city. When Montezuma spoke to his subjects from a palace balcony, the Aztecs threw stones at the emperor. They considered him a traitor. The conquistadors claimed that Montezuma died from being hit with the stones that were hurled by the Aztec people. The Aztecs charged that the conquistadors killed Montezuma because they realized he was no longer of use to them. We'll never know, but either way, Montezuma was dead. Cortes decided it was time to leave Tenochtitlan. He had a few thousand soldiers, including the Native American allies, under his command. They were surrounded by up to 200,000 hostile Aztecs. Obviously, not all of them were fighters, since a lot of those people were old or children. But whatever the exact numbers were, Cortes and his troops were greatly outnumbered. I told you earlier how there were three causeways which connected Tenochtitlan to the mainland. The Aztecs had built these causeways mostly of solid rock and earth, but they had put a few bridges in the middle of the causeways that could be removed in the face of an enemy. The Aztecs now removed those bridges from the causeways. It was going to be difficult for the Spaniards and their allies to leave the city. Cortes ordered his entire command to prepare to leave. And they were not just trying to save their necks. They wanted to take all of the Aztecs' treasure with them. We don't know how many pounds or wagon loads of gold there were, but it was a lot. On the night of June 30, 1520, the Spaniards and their allies set off over one of the causeways to the mainland. It appears that they had built a temporary bridge to replace the bridge that had been removed by the Aztecs. Things did not go as planned. This night became known as La Noche Triste. Please forgive my poor pronunciation because I do not speak Spanish, but the translation for La Noche Triste is the sad night or the night of sorrows. The Spaniards and their native allies were attacked by overwhelming numbers of Aztecs. The attacks came from Aztec soldiers on foot along the causeway, as well as many Aztecs in canoes. The Spaniards and their allies suffered many casualties. It's unknown how many soldiers were killed, but it was a large percentage of Cortes's forces. Also, most of the horses were killed. In addition, the Spaniards lost practically all of their gold and treasure as it spilled from the causeway into Lake Texcoco. This was not a small matter. It was not just plunder. Cortes was going to send 1/5 of all of the treasure to the Spanish king to keep in the monarch's good graces. And Cortes was going to use a lot of the gold and other treasure to buy the loyalty of his soldiers. Eventually, Cortes led his remaining troops to the native city of Tlaxcala. As I explained earlier, that was the city that provided most of the Native American soldiers for Cortes. Most people in Cortes's position would have figured that they were lucky to get away with their lives and would have left Mexico and sailed back to Spain if they could. But not this guy. He was determined to conquer the Aztec Empire. Cortes received some great luck from a horrible disease. At some point in 1520, after the Spaniards left, a smallpox epidemic erupted in Tenochtitlan. As I told you earlier, estimates are that in the year 1520, 40% of the Aztec population died of smallpox. You always have to bear in mind that when we're dealing with events from centuries ago, we only have estimates. But if that estimate is anywhere close to accurate, the loss of close to half of their population was a severe blow to the Aztecs. Instead of going straight for Tenochtitlan, Cortes developed a new strategy. He and his army conquered many of the cities and tribes which were allied with the Aztecs. After conquering a large section of the Aztec Empire, then Cortes went for the capital city. He decided to lay siege to Tenochtitlan. He cut the supply of fresh water by destroying the aqueduct. He also prevented food from entering the city. Eventually, the people of Tenochtitlan were dying of thirst and hunger. And remember, they had already been suffering from the smallpox epidemic. Cortes decided to avoid the total reliance of the 3 causeways into Tenochtitlan. This was one of his brilliant innovations. He had large ships built away from the capital city. The ships were then taken apart and transported to Lake Texcoco. We think that Cortes had 13 of these ships built. They were between 40 and 50 feet long. The Spanish ships were much larger than the Aztec canoes. They were propelled by both oars and sails. When propelled by wind and sail, the Spanish ships could travel much faster than the Aztec canoes and could literally overrun the small Aztec vessels. The Spanish ships were also used as gun platforms. They had cannons which were used to bombard Tenochtitlan. After a siege of many months, most of Tenochtitlan had been destroyed by fires set by the Spaniards along with cannon shots. The date which is recorded as the surrender of Tenochtitlan to Cortes and his troops is August 13, 1521. It's difficult to find any remains of Tenochtitlan today. This is because Mexico City was built on top of what was Tenochtitlan. For the Aztecs, building their capital city of Tenochtitlan in a lake worked out very well. But when the Spaniards decided to locate their capital of New Spain in that same location, it's proved to be a disaster. They drained Lake Texcoco. As a result, modern Mexico City is on a dry lake bed. This has caused 2 major geological problems. The first problem is that the dry lake bed amplifies earthquakes. The softer soil causes the seismic waves to be amplified. In short, earthquakes in Mexico City cause much more damage. The second problem Mexico City faces is that it is sinking. That's right, Mexico City is literally sinking. Once Lake Texcoco was drained, the only source of fresh water for Mexico City was the underground aquifer. As the aquifer has been depleted, the ground above it is sinking into the empty space where the water had been located. Because Mexico City is very urban, meaning mostly concrete and pavement, the aquifer cannot be replenished because there are not enough areas where rain can seep into the ground. This is a serious problem. Mexico City is sinking as much as 20 inches per year. Unless they can solve this problem, this will cause buildings, roads, and all of the underground infrastructure like pipes and wiring to rupture. So what is the legacy of Hernan Cortes? For better or for worse, he was certainly one of the greatest conquerors in history. Some of those conquerors are fondly remembered. For some reason, Alexander the Great is generally looked at favorably, even though he spent his career conquering everybody he can find, killing unknown numbers of people, and destroying cities and civilizations. But Cortes is generally viewed in a bad light. He is considered the poster child for the Europeans who came and destroyed Native American civilizations. The one thing named after him was the Sea of Cortes. Old maps used to list that body of water as both the Sea of Cortes and the Gulf of California. But it seems like nobody uses that term Sea of Cortes anymore. Everybody just calls it the Gulf of California. I think, overall, people want to forget Cortes and the mass murder he committed. That's it for today. Please subscribe to this podcast. Please like this and my other episodes. Ratings and likes greatly help with the algorithms that determine the placement of podcasts on particular apps. So if you're listening on a podcast app like Spotify or Apple Podcasts, which allow for ratings, I would greatly appreciate a 5-star rating. Please tell your friends, relatives, coworkers. Word of mouth is the best way to increase the audience for this podcast. Please check out my website, historyanalyzed.com. Thank you for listening. Catch you next episode.